So hello everyone and welcome to another conversation of the third cycle of conversations on corporeal architecture. And today it's my great honor to introduce Harry Francis Mallgrave. Harry Francis Mallgrave is a distinguished professor emeritus from the Illinois Institute of Technology and an honorary fellow of the Royal Institute of British Architects. He received his PhD in architecture from the University of Pennsylvania and has enjoyed a career as a scholar, translator, editor, and architect. In 1996, he won the Ellis Davis Hitchcock Award from the Society of Architectural Historians for his intellectual biography, Gottfried Semper, Architects of the 19th Century. He has published more than a dozen books on architectural history and theory. His most recent book, Building Paradise, Episodes in Paradisiacal Thinking, argues on behalf of a design and planning ethic centered squarely on cultural needs and personal aspirations. Harry, please, you can start.
Okay, well, thank you. Right now you're at the Stuttgart School of Architecture?
Hochschule für Technik Stuttgart.
Yeah, okay. And everyone is studying architecture?
No, we have students from architecture, interior design, and also anyone from urban planning. No, this time.
Okay, all right, okay, that's good. All right, well, let me. I'll go ahead and start with the images. So is that fine? Everyone can see that?
Not yet.
Oh. All right, let's. I have to get out of this here. Oh, I'm sorry for this problem.
It's okay. We are still having some people joining in a little bit late, so it's all fine.
I've got a full screen and I can't get any prompt to do anything with it.
Maybe you have to click again on the file of the PowerPoint just to activate it, and then go again to share screen on Zoom and select it from the window with the options.
All right, so. All right, what can you see now? Can you see, do you see the images up at all?
No.
Well, this is what I.
Okay, now something starts, yes.
Okay. All right, well, let me go ahead and move this over and get it a full screen.
Perfect.
Okay, great. I'm sorry for the delay.
No problem.
I'm not, wasn't brought up on computers and, and I don't really care much for them. I want to start with this very simple question, which is up on the screen, which is why we're building the same buildings today that we built 100 years ago. It's like we're in some sort of a time warp where the dream of Van der Rohe in the cities of our 10, 20, 30 million people have become sort of the nightmare of global architecture. I guess what I want to do is to go in a little bit of what I have an explanation of why I think this has come about and why. And I want to start with this particular passage from Evan Thompson and Francis Varela. Varela was a Chilean biologist. Thompson is a phenomenological philosopher. And I always find it interesting because, and I'll go ahead and let you read it. I've always admired the passage because in one swoop, as it were, he's really so thoroughly cut down a lot of the ideas of the 20th century with respect to the fact that we have that we have these Cartesian dualities in a way continuing to affect the way that we think, the fallacies that we have a body apart from the environment, that we have a mind apart from the body, and that reason and emotion are two separate things. This is actually quite different. In the late 20th century, there were still these models of the brain as some sort of a computer system operating on some sort of a logical series of networks. And in fact, the whole science of cognitive science grew out of that particular idea. But I think what we've learned in the last 30 years has pretty much overturned entirely that type of thinking. Biologically, ecologically, and socially, we're very much intertwined with one another. And that this may seem sort of radical thinking from today's perspective, but in fact, if we go back through the 19th century, which is where I want to start, I want to show that it actually isn't quite new to architecture, that it has been around for quite some time, and we sort of lost sight of it, as it were, in the sort of the evolution of architectural or design thinking over the past 100 years or so. So I want to go back to Schopenhauer and start with his notion of inner form, because what he did, which I always found so very interesting, is that architecture is the lowest of the fine arts. He was sort of fighting the idealist of Hegel and Schelling and others around the time. And so he did it. He said that architecture is the lowest of the fine arts simply because of its materiality. And he effectively viewed architecture as a conflict between gravity and rigidity. The fact that, as he says here, gravity wants to pull all matter to the ground, and architect, by some sort of circumstance of structural thinking and whatever, will deprive the gravitational forces and prevent them from reaching the shortest path to their satisfaction. This was an idea that a few years later, Karl Bertiger, who I think most of you may know, professor at the Schinkel's Bell Academy in the 1830s through the 1850s, he interpreted Schopenhauer in the sense that he too saw all architecture as sort of a response from, or a conflict between materiality and gravity. A molding in a cornice of an entablature, for instance, has an upward curvature if it appears, if it's in the upper part of the entablature and doesn't have any load bearing on it. It has a sort of a vertical curve to it pointing upward. Whereas an genus of a Doric order has a horizontal configuration because the weight of the entablature essentially has pressed down upon it and squashed it, as we see sort of articulated here in the one of the temples at Paestum. Now, again, this was to me a very interesting sort of notion that we in a way we interpret architecture as sort of a way to deter or to articulate the sort of the what it is, a material art that depends on a certain sort of ingenuity to hold it together. Bertinger came up with this theory, the Technik Stuttgart, and wrote a couple of volumes on it, trying to argue that all Greek ornamentation was founded on this principle. And then Semper came along just a few years later. In fact, he was writing the first volume of his work, Der Stil, just when Bertinger's work, Die Tectonic, was being published. And he took a somewhat different slant in just a few passages here and there, and he was referring to the ionic order. And effectively, what he offers is the notion that it was detailed in a way that it sort of takes the form of a spring. It's artistically enlivened, supporting elements become organisms in which the load above exists only to activate the life inherent in the column. And so ionic order, it doesn't have this sort of clash between materiality and gravity pulling it down, but rather it's a supple and elastic strength within the ionic volute. And it offers, as he says, resistance without violence. So this sort of set up a kind of a path of thinking within 19th century aesthetics, which is going to follow through the full second half of the 19th century. And the person who really stepped forward to try to interpret what he had read in Semper was Robert Fischer. He was the son of Friedrich Theodor Fischer, who happened to be who was one of Semper's best friend at the ETH in Zurich. They shared daily drinks and a lot of ideas back and forth between them. And so the son took it upon himself to try to sort of understand or comprehend what Semper and others were trying to say at this time. So he posed the question of how do we experience a work of art? And I think in a sort of a moment of profound insight, he came up with the answer that we experience a work of art by projecting our own bodies into the artistic event. That is a projection that is both physiognomic and emotional. And of course, he termed the coin Einfühlung as a way to describe this feeling ourselves into an object. And in looking at, this is one of his quotations, when looking at a seashell on a beach, we sort of compress ourselves into a small but intricate object, which evokes a contractive feeling in the same way that we are in a small corridor, we have a sort of a contracted feeling of our bodies. In viewing, we might have experience of an expansive feeling if it's a very large building, a very large space. So in other words, we have what came to be called an empathetic relationship with the artistic event that is both, again, physiognomic and emotional. Now, the word Einfühlung got translated into English and French and a few other languages as empathy. It's not exactly the correct translation, but there's no other. I mean, it's a difficult sort of concept to translate. So that was his dissertation of 1873. And if we move forward 20 years later, what Robert Fischer did was set off a whole series of writings of thousands and thousands of pages on this notion of Einfühlung and how it works. And it really sort of worked in very, very keenly with the rise of psychological theory at the time. And you even had the psychophysiological theories as well. So again, it was a very sort of interesting period where people were really trying to understand how we perceive, how we see and experience, not see, but how we experience the world with all of our capacities. And as you see in 1886, Heinrich Wölfflin, in his dissertation, Prolegomena on the Psychology of Architecture, opens his dissertation with the idea that physical forms possess a character only because we possess a body. If we were purely visual beings, which is really a 20th century concept that we are just eyes interpreting and building through signs, semiotic signs, or other sorts of things, concepts such as space. If we were purely visual beings, he argues, we would always be denied an aesthetic judgment of the physical world. But of course, we know the nature of gravity, contraction, strength, and so on. And this allows us, this experience allows us really to identify with the forms of the world. So that was in 1886. And Schmarshoff, August Schmarshoff, who went to Leipzig, just a year or two older than Wölfflin, came up with a very counter argument to Wölfflin's argument, because if Wölfflin says basically architecture is form, then Schmarshoff turned it around and said, no, the essence of architectural creation is space. And he, in fact, defined architecture not as form, but as the creatus of space. But this was not, and this is an important point, it was not in the abstract or geometric sense of 20th century theory that he said this. Because as you read his dissertation a little more closely, he says the experience of space is not a conceptual process. It is created only what he refers to as the residues of sensory experience to which the muscular sensations of the body, the sensitivity of our skin, and the structure of our body all contribute. And again, this was at the 1893. He, of course, continued writings, continued writing about this notion of space all the way up through about 1910. But that's really where things began to change around. Because if we go on a few years, we're going to see Siegfried Gideon, who happened to be took his dissertation under Heinrich Wölfflin, did not accept Wölfflin's idea in the end that architecture was really about mass and form, but rather he took the notion of space, but he emptied that notion from many of the contexts in which Schmarshoff had attempted to put it in. What was going on was that when Cubism began coming about around 1910, it was at the same time when we had sort of the first theories of space-time and theories of relativity in physics. And that notion of space-time caught on within artistic circles. And Cubists began to, or at least critics and writers about Cubism began to define this new art, this abstract art, as sort of a looking at multiple images of a single image from different perspectives simultaneously on one particular canvas. And this is where Gideon, who was, again, trained in art history, of course, his wife was very much a historian of art, modern art, where he sort of took that idea in the 1920s. It sort of worked here and there. It wasn't very prominent, but by about 1929, Gideon and a few other people were beginning to apply this notion of space-time to architecture. And for Gideon, this was a key thing, because what he was, of course, he was started out with the Bauhaus, and then he, with friends of Gropius at the Bauhaus, and then befriended Philippe Bouzier. And he was trying to justify this new architecture that was being created. And so he referred to it as in a way, as space-time architecture. And he defined it through the visual effects of transparency and the hovering effect of interpenetrating elements. Again, this was something new. Our architecture before this was very heavy, very massive. And now suddenly we have these sort of light little structures put up with glass on the exterior facade so that you get this penetration of views through the building. You get this sort of lightness of these large concrete floors sort of hovering in space, as it were. And this was a new sort of experience as far as coming to see architectural design. And of course, this is what Mies and other people were also working on in the 1920s. Now, I don't fault Gideon for this. I mean, it's an interesting perspective, but if you just stand back for a second, he's done two things with this notion of space-time, one of which he's reduced architecture to sort of a pictorial form. And in space-time and architecture, he actually coupled these two images on the screen. And secondly, he conceptualized the practice of architecture. That we somehow we have to, these hovering forms, he would articulate it through notions of interpenetration and movement and things like that, so that architecture became sort of a conceptual process and an abstract process that didn't necessarily have any meaning. Schopenhauer certainly looked at architecture as very much having a meaning. What we got there in the end was the glass box, the same glass box that really carried down all the way through the 20th century, even into postmodernism, down to that era of deconstructivism. And of course, with our global architecture today, it's virtually the only building form that we have. Almost everything being built today is a glass box. So I'm sort of taking on a little bit of a historical detour, because the point I want to make right now, I got it the wrong way here, is that there have been very important discoveries made over the previous 25, 30 years, which should, I think, have a significant have a significant effect on how we design and how we approach the design problem. And I'm basically going to speak today about form, but I think there are also cultural and other important factors that also come into play, but it's too much to do at one time. But over the past 30 years, we've made enormous strides in how we understand architecture with our genes, our neurology, our hormones, our connections with the larger environment, and our immediate environment with the larger ecology of the planet itself. And I think very pivotal for architecture was the discovery of these cross-modal mirror systems. I don't know if you know much about this, or if I assume you must have heard it. But I think this is a kind of a major discovery for what it portends for the practice of architecture. And basically what it does, it really sort of confirms that earlier thesis of Robert Fischer, that we effectively feel ourselves into the world, into the objects of the world, into other people, et cetera, through our own sort of motor circuits. So if we hear someone, for instance, playing a piano in another room, it's going to, as we now know, it's going to create action in the premotor areas of our brain related to the movement of our fingers, as if we were playing a piano. And if we are skilled pianists, then that it's even more acutely defined in terms of what fingers are being prompted at what point. If we see someone across the room being touched on the arm lightly, we feel that touch lightly or even violently on our arm, if that be the case, because effectively we mirror that neural activity of that touch onto our own bodies. If we see someone walking into the room with a smile, it makes everyone more cheerful, because effectively we empathize with that sort of happiness that we see expressed in someone's face. Now, there was one study that, as you see, from 2008, and so it's only 14 years old or so. But I think, again, it's a very important study for architecture. And as you see here, there are 4 images where they tested people on MRIs. One is an arm, as you see, a hand touching a chair, which we can, of course, understand the strength of wood and if it's a rocking chair or not. And you see a palm branch touching someone's hand. And of course, we know that sensation, and we know another hand touching the hand. But as a control image that they put into the study, they had a palm branch touching her, assuming there would be no empathetic response to it within our motor circuits. Well, this proved not to be the case. In effect, we empathize with that palm branch touching the chair as if we were the chair or the palm branch, whatever. So this is what the gist of this thing, the summary of this particular experiment was. The same motor simulation principle seems to apply in the observation of any touch. The space around us is full of objects accidentally touching one another, that is, without any animate involvement. It could be a pine cone, it could be leaves splashing on leaves. But out of this grew this, what they call models of embodied simulation, which posits that the same neural structures involved in our own body-related experiences contribute to the conceptualization of what we observe in the world around us. Again, I think these models of embodied simulation are, again, direct themselves directly. I mean, they really sort of summarize really precisely what architecture is, in the same way that palm branch touches that chair. And that is the fact that architecture is an embodied experience, and it always has been and always will be, even though the glass and the steel of the Bauhaus building may have very little sort of effect on us. But again, this is something that was long understood, and of course we have a different architecture through centuries that try to express this in various different forms. But I want to note two examples of this. This particular church in Portugal, it was the monastery, the Church of Jesus. Around 2008, David Friedberg and Victoria Galeazzi published a paper called Emotion, Emotion, and Empathy and Aesthetic Experience. And what they did was sort of chart the fact that what embodied simulation means for, not just for, it means for the arts in general. It can be sculpture. If we see a Michelangelo sculpture, we feel ourselves into the body. If we see a painting, someone is being hurt, we feel the sorrow of that. And also, as you see here in architecture, we have ways of sort of intensifying the drama or the atmosphere of a particular building, with this, in this case, the twisted column. Because what this was, according to the way Friedberg and Galeazzi described it, we have that sensation of ourselves being twisted and relating to with a twisted column. And of course, this is a church dedicated to the crucifixion of Christ. So there is that level of sorrow and sort of pain, which is part of the theology. So this is, this is, I think, fairly understandable. Again, the way that they explain it, the activation of embodied mechanisms encompassing the simulation of actions, emotions, and corporal sensations. But this again is something that I think with this model of embodied simulation, we can go back and really sort of reinterpret architecture in many respects. Even we go back and reinterpret modern architecture with it. And I got this one example of the Kimball Museum of Cons, because these half vaults that span 94 feet or 30 meters, what he did, they're sort of half vaults, and they have an opening at the center where the light is emitted, and then he put in these convex reflectors, which transmit the light back up and around the vault itself. What this does is really it sort of lightens these two massive beams, as it were, which are hovering over this room, as Gideon might describe it. But the light itself is what lifts it up in a way that it seems almost weightless. And he also demonstrates that at the very end of it, where you see the light of the arc with the wall, with the painting on it as well. So there's a certain sort of sensitivity here to Kant, and Kant was sort of very sort of metaphysical, I think, in his thinking. But I mean, I have no doubt what he was trying to do here was to not make this seem like a dark and ominous sort of room with these heavy ceilings on it, but rather something where all the attention is now given to the materials and to the artworks below. And if you come to the corner detail of that, you can see again how he brings down that arch in a way that it almost has no influence whatsoever, as Semper might say. And you even have the air handling unit coming in below that to show that nothing effectively is being squashed, as it were. And so this, leads me to the point of detailing and what detailing has always been. And of course, Edward Ford has written kind of several books on detailing. He says that effectively detailing is very much what ornamentation was, in a way we empathize as we were to take the architecture out of its degree of abstraction and establish a level of intimacy between us and the building. And of course, in someone like Scarpa, you have all these effects of the aroma of the garden, the trickling of the water, the movement of the water, the texture of the rock, and then the heavier forms in and around as a way, basically, to go out and have a nice cappuccino in the afternoon. So in this sense, I mentioned earlier that the word empathy is really, it's not the right word in English, but because we don't empathize with the architectural forms or the details, but rather in a way, we feel ourselves into those forms and those details. In a way where, again, we're projecting ourselves into those activities. Now, these sort of models, as you see, sort of came about around the turn of the century and just after. And of course, the mirror neurons were discovered around 1992, 1993 in a lab in Parma. But also, there are really sort of two corollaries to this notion of empathy or embodied simulation that I want to emphasize. And one is the idea, and again, I want to counter that with the 20th century, we had this sense that we had a rational mind, and then we had these sort of emotional feelings driving somewhere below us or outside of us or wherever, but they were sort of interfering with the logical workings of the mind itself. And this is another area where there's, I think, been an enormous about some major that have come about in terms of what emotion is. Biological sciences today know that no longer think of the brain or cognition as some kind of a logical computer which is interrupted by emotional impulses. The mind, for lack of a better word, is the human body, but the human body in the sense that it is extended into the world around us. Evan Thompson defines emotion as a prototype whole organism event. And this actually goes back to 19th century theories of emotion that, in fact, it's the emotion that drives the panic and not the panic driving the emotion. So Thompson says it's a prototype whole organism event, one that coordinates virtually every aspect of the organism. Maxine Sheets Johnson writes that affective feelings and tactile kinetic feelings are experientially intertwined. In other words, that we can bring this into the whole realm of movement. And that emotion and proprioception entail a postural attitude or corporal readiness to act in some way or another. In other words, we don't see something and then respond with an emotion, but rather the emotion is part of the organism that we are that effectively gives us an attitude. If we come into a room that looks threatening, we don't want to go into that room. Conversely, if we go into a room with a lot of friends, we have, again, a very different. In other words, it's not the emotion, it's the emotion effectively is sort of, it really can't be distinguished from the body feelings and the brain's interpretations, as it were. Giovanna Colombetti, who makes the case that because all living systems are sense-making systems, emotion prevents cognition through and through, and emotion is thus integral to both perception and action. What models of embodied simulation also underscores the fact that good architecture is intensely emotional, although again, they can be very passive emotions. It seduces our bodies. Emotions are effectively seduced into architecture through our sort of emotional awareness. And I'm sure you're all familiar with the notion of atmosphere, which is the other sort of part of this idea that architecture is emotional. And again, it's interesting if you go back to the late 1990s, early 2000s, and the writers such as Peter Zumthor and Johanni Plasma, I'm sure you're familiar with, they brought this whole idea of atmosphere into architecture. Again, I think predicated in part on these early notions of, or these early models of embodied stimulation. There's a connection there, and there's a lot of ways I think that this can be explored. So this is my last image, and as I say, I've sort of left out a lot that I'd like to put in, but what it also, I think, implies is that the very notion that architecture is sort of the making of a place or making places for people. So this is the whole sort of social cultural dimension. I won't go into too much, but the point is that we, for years now, as long as I've been around in school, looked at architecture as the making of buildings. And what I think a lot of this body of theory suggests is that architecture is really sort of the making of place. It's the making of social places for social cultural events to transpire, but also for historical understanding. And we now know that, of course, everyone, there's a little bit more to this as well, in the sense that we now know that there are particular areas in the hippocampus that are related to our understanding of place and the importance of place within the cognitive system that we have. Places and memory, for instance, is stored in an area of the hippocampus that also helps to control and understand movement within places. And of course, these go back to the savannas of Africa, where place was vitally important for survival, to go out on a hunt and find your way back. So I'll close with this one last point, that architecture is really the making of place. And there are a lot of writers who have embraced this idea. Christopher Thiele has written that in Aboriginal cultures, places and landscapes are not what one would call natural, rather they are sedimented in history and sentiment. Taking hold of land requires both a knowledge of the physiographic features of the terrain and the connection of place with one's ancestral history. It is from this sense of place there arises the artistic lore of songs, ceremonies, and sacred objects, what the anthropologist Ellen Disianiak has referred to as cross-modal sensations of tactility and kinesis. Disianiak is another one who's drawn a lot from these models of embodied simulation. The architectural critic Carson Harries says that the ethical function of the designer is to draw out the connection between place and dwelling in a Heideggerian sense. To dwell is to feel at home, he says. Building allows for dwelling by granting a sense of place. And then finally, the big philosopher, the major philosopher on the idea of place today is Geoffrey Malpass, the Australian, who's made the vital point that place is not something simply encountered and experienced. Place is integral to the very structure and possibility of experience. So I always love this cross-modal sensations of tactility and kinesis of Disianiak's, because it's just a kind of a wonderful presentation of what architecture as sort of a poetic making of places and emotions and the like can become when we stop thinking of building as simple objects or art objects, as some architects like to think of their towers or museums or whatever. So with that, I'll guess I have to stop this. Let's see here. How did I do this before? If you have any questions, we can start that right now as I sort of look at that.
Okay. There you have it. Good. And then you have to stop sharing the screen also in Zoom.
Oh, okay.
So that we can see you.
Yeah.
Not in such a
All right.
small.
Let me find out how to do that.
Yeah, perfect. There we go. So thank you so much for this really wonderful and inspiring lecture. This was so special also for our students, because they haven't the assignment of doing a performance over a certain amount of time. They are working on it. It's their assignment for the semester. And they will be relating with the exterior of buildings and the interior of buildings, and also with public spaces of their choice through a playful, intuitive approach. So this topic of empathy, and in connection with our relationship with body and space, is really the core of their task. And I'm really happy that your lecture also brought together all these topics around the notion of empathy, especially not empathy in the English sense, but exactly as you so profoundly described in your work, this concept of feeling into, of how we can actually relate to the objects and to the spaces and to the people. Even we experience to this capacity of transporting ourselves, or sharing somehow this experience in a corporeal sense. And I think that what's most relevant about your work, also your body of work, has been that also through my own experience of reading it, that it can really shift our awareness of how we experience space, how we actually can understand much better how the spaces and how we deal with them really interfere also with our emotions, or even shape our emotions and shape how we deal with the world. So I would like to ask you as a first question, what was maybe the personal experience or the moment that you felt, perhaps intuitively, that you felt that you wanted to investigate this topic? What was it, an experience of a particular building, or maybe an artwork that triggered this curiosity?
No, toward the end of the century, I was asked to write a book on postmodern theory, architecture theory since 1968, or if we even get the name of it now. I think it was architectural theory since 1968, but it was basically on the book on postmodern history. And when I was doing that, because I started architecture school in 1965, which put me back at the very end of modernism, as it were. And as I was going through school, we were getting the first sort of notions of postmodernism, this sort of break with the past. And I was sort of young and naive for a while, a few decades. And went along with it. I thought it was interesting to have something different, something new coming along. But by the end of the as it sort of deteriorated into the Derridian whatever models of the late 1980s and early 90s, it became almost insufferable as a body of theory. Wasn't doing anything other than reducing architecture to some sort of a conceptual game. And that's when I was finishing this book, and I realized I had no answer to this whatsoever. In other words, where architecture might go in the 21st century versus where it had gone over the last 30 years. So it's very curious because it seemed to me that what had happened, that theory had fundamentally collapsed, and it did. I mean, there was an extraordinary amount of writings on architecture in the 80s and 90s. Everyone was writing, every architect was writing. And then suddenly, with the change of the millennium, all that disappeared. There was no longer any theory out there, as it were. The Eisenmans and other people of the world just simply stopped participating, as it were. And so I was looking at that time for something that another direction that I felt was needed there. And there was a little bit of work. John Nyans, an art historian who's written, has written a couple books, had written a couple books about that time, where he was looking at some of the research of Warburg and others. And I know what it was. I was at a conference at the University of British Columbia, and this was about 2003. And it was a conference on empathy. And I thought I was going there in order to talk about the notion of 19th century empathy. But as it turns out, there were two groups of people there. One were neuroscientists who were now doing these models of embodied simulation and also probing the workings of the brain. And the other were the philosophers who were interpreting this in a very sort of phenomenological sense. So then I began to realize that there was something major happening that I was unaware of. And it did have a lot of implications for design. And there's always the problem when you start doing something like that, because architects traditionally, sort of view science as some sort of a conspiracy to make us all positivists and some sort of set of rules in design. But of course, phenomenology will take a very different sort of approach and view the world as as through human imagination, human creativity, and anything but sort of following rules, as it were. So really, what got me started was to try to connect those two sort of vantage points where we could use some of this science, the biological sciences, and I use it in a broader term, in order to understand, to make us better designers, to make us better, more creative architects in our thinking and how we approach design. It took a while. I lost a lot of friends there for a few years who thought I was going crazy by trying to turn architecture into a science. But that was the last thing in the world I was trying to do. I was trying to, if we can learn something about ourselves, learn better about ourselves, then we can become better architects. Science is not going to suggest that the walls have to be painted green or anything.
Mm-hmm. Well, this is an answer that also brings me a lot of ideas for other questions, and that's also where I definitely also can connect to, also with my own work and research, and what I have been doing with the students already for some time. Exactly this idea of trying to apply the tools and some of the knowledge that we have from neuroscience, and try to apply it in a practical and meaningful way. In the design studio, to try to explore possibilities of how can we actually bring the body back into architecture, not just theory but also practice, and how can we maybe become more connected also to the feelings and to the experience of the body of the user. Also in your work, you not specifically in this presentation, but in your book From Object to Experience, you also develop a lot this argument of how it's so important to not just design buildings that fulfill specific symbolic or just focus on a particular image that we want to perhaps transmit with digital media, but really focus on the idea of how the user is going to feel using the space. How also by designing architecture and interior spaces, we are in some ways also somehow trying to compose the experience of the user. So would you say, from your observation and also from your experience, that we have made some progress moving towards this way of thinking in design, or would you say that maybe now, even with the pandemic, we are perhaps retrocessing? What would be your opinion?
Well, I think more students and more architectural programs are at least bringing in some of this material today, and I think that has only happened in the last 5 years or so. When I retired from teaching, I think it was 2014. That design studio had not changed. It was in Crown Hall at Illinois Institute of Technology. It had not changed since Mies van der Rohe had been in the building, as far as what was being taught and how it was taught. So effectively, we had 50 years of immobility as far as architectural education went. I think I'm not sure. I'm not close enough to many schools today to know how much this has changed. I think some of the premier schools in the country, in the US, are actually some of the worst as far as what they do with the design education. It's all that star architecture sort of thing. But I think in Europe in particular, there are a number of programs like yours and in other places as well, where a lot of this material is being drawn in. As you know, I had that dialogue with Sergei Epstein on this issue of how to sort of marry science and art, as it were, and it really is it's a difficult issue, because it's not, one can take a neuroscience or the biological science or embodied simulation, whatever, but that's not really going to take us very far. It really has to come into the design studio itself. We have to bring back that sort of that sort of cultural foundation that used to be so important in design. We seem to, within our globalized culture, has very much lost sight of entirely. So I'm sure it's going to continue to become more prominent in the coming years, but it's a slow process, and it's going to take it's going to take another generation to fully embrace the possibilities of this, because it just it's not out there in a prominent enough way to have much of a change today.
Mm-hmm. I have another question, and this is a question that has been maybe building up over the last year, perhaps. And I was reminded of it again, because in many of your slides in the presentation, you had these wonderful pictures of interiors of buildings and also exteriors with a lot of ornament. And of course, I know you appreciate ornament, especially because of your dedication to the work of Semper, who, of course, discussed so much about the importance of ornament. So I wanted to ask you, as someone who is a historian, what would you say for the future, now that we have so many discussions about colonialism and also cultural appropriation, and also how we can interpret or be more aware of specific ideological messages that can come with architectural heritage? What would you say would be a mindful and sensitive approach to address this topic for the future?
Well, I mean, I know you're familiar with Building Paradise. And what I really intended that to be was sort of in a way, sort of a subversive strategy, as it were. Architects always like to think of themselves as utopians, and they really like very large projects and major changes to society. And we're going to realize convolutions today, some positive and some, I think, quite negative in terms of what happens socially, culturally. I think in that book, Building Paradise, I used the word paradise because it was originally referred to as a walled-in garden. And it's thinking on a small scale. You can put a garden in your windowsill, you can put a garden in your front yard, you can put a garden in a park or in a city. But I mean, in a way, it's a strategy. There are many ways to sort of build that garden, as it were. We can do it, through the mosaics of Ravenna that sort of transport us into another world and another sort of mindset of millennia ago. And we can do it with very simple things, like that, where we again sort of re-engage with the idea that the whole purpose of architecture is to make us happy and also to make people happy. So it can be very small features, like the little garden fountain in Scarpa's museum in Venice, or it can be something much grander, the preservation of a forest, or a making of a city space that can attract and gather people to enjoy themselves and celebrate their sort of cultural unity, as it were. So anyway, the point of the book is that we can have I think trying to conceive grand models of what some utopian future should be, that we can just work at a very small scale collectively and really make some pretty significant changes in our environments today. So it doesn't take a grand strategy, as it were. It just takes a kind of a notion of paradise.
Mm-hmm. I made this question because very often I have observed also the patterns of how our 21st century has been developing. And that's, as you mentioned also in your presentation, we seem to be repeating some specific patterns, and we even had now a pandemic, and now there's also a war very close to us in Europe. So there seem to be, at least in my perception, a lot of parallels to some of the things we have experienced. And I'm glad that you bring this idea or this topic of utopia, because I think that this could also, if we are not aware and if we are not conscious of, it might also be a pattern that we tend to repeat. For example, trying to think about, okay, let's create again a new architecture, move towards a new architecture, which doesn't communicate past ideologies, which somehow makes some kind of tabula rasa. So would you say that perhaps the risk of going in this direction is a real risk, or is more something that we have to deal with?
No, I think I don't see a risk, and I mean, taking a different view of what design is you know, there have been hundreds of studies showing that poor environments create bad behavior on the people. And I would not be far from suggesting that the global sort of environments, look at to give you an example, when I was asked to run this international study for sustainable new cities. And I took a group of students over to China some years ago. And we were looking at this was in the early 2000s, when they were building literally cities of 5 and 10 million all over the country, 50 or so, I think, under construction at that point. And we were talking the strategies talking the strategic ways of thinking of the city with the students there and our students from Chicago. And we began to realize that they were not interested in anything other. The Chinese students and the Chinese planners at the time, and they're still there, were not interested in doing anything other than replicating sort of the worst of the global metropolises of the West. And we saw the same sort of events happening around Dubai and in London and other places. They didn't want to think of a city in any other way than what their image of a successful financial center appeared. And of course, we're seeing the result of that today. We're looking at the situation in Shanghai. They've been on lockdown and not even allowed to leave the buildings for weeks and weeks on end. And now Beijing is on the verge of it. And again, I think there is a connection to, if you want to take it to the Ukrainian horrors that we're seeing, that the money and sort of Putin's you see the transformation of Moscow over the past 20 years as well, with all of their new towers, that it sort of helps to, it's not a causal relationship, but it certainly sort of helps to ingrain a lethargy and intellectual lethargy and sort of a lack of humanism. So to me, I mean, I think if we could just try to make architecture more human, I don't see any risk in that. I mean, I think that's essential. It should be our fundamental mission, to sort of humanize the world a little bit more than what we're doing today.
Yes, I would always have more questions to make, but now I give the room to our students to come here and to make questions. I hope you have prepared some. No? Okay, I think maybe they need a little bit more time to process, because some of the ideas were the first time that maybe they heard, or they would need a little bit more time to process. So I would ask from our audience, I know that Milton is also here with us, and Margaret Krabeka also. So please go ahead, Milton.
So Dr. Mallgrave, as usual, this is brilliant. Bravo on such a good talk, such a concise argument, and the connections that you make from it. I've been inspired in my own thinking by what you've talked about today, the issues and the way you present them. I'd like to pursue a more of a, not more, let's say translation into a common parlance of what you're saying. I think people react very in a gut level to architectural experience, spatial, environmental experience. So there's like and dislike. There is happy and unhappy, which I know you've been thinking about. So I'm wondering how you would relate those gut feelings to, well, first of all, do you think gut feelings are valid? And if they are, can you discuss a little bit about what I think is the undervaluation of them in the neuroscience community and in the architectural community to some extent, maybe lesser extent, in terms of moving forward with this less objective way of thinking?
Well, I wouldn't say that gut feelings are sort of undervalued. I think that really by these sort of the newer models of emotion have really sort of stressed that this is, I mean, we now know, I mean, the hormonal responses of the endocrine system as we experience these different types of environments. I mean, this has really sort of highlighted the fact that these gut feelings, as it were, are really sort of fundamental to our being. I mean, as a, you know, the problem is to try to qualify it in the sense of how exactly do you make a design that actually, you know, successfully, that sort of projects itself in a way that other people can respond in a good sense to a particular environment. And I think some of those tools are really sort of the basic tools that always go back through history. I mentioned that Destianiak quote at the end, tactile and kinesis, that little phrase. But you know, you've got the color, you've got the texture, you've got the levels of complexity and intimacy, and sort of all these variations that really come into a good environment. It's not going to be. It's not something that's going to be instilled in a designer by reading a few textbooks in the biological sciences, but it is something that at least they will become more aware of their own reactions to particular environments and how that can be a very sort of positive thing in terms of directing a design, you know, again, with some imagination, you know, that's going to enhance in a way the world that we live in.
So just a couple of points on that. One of them is, I think it's intriguing to wonder about to what extent our gut feelings, our hormonal reactions are hardwired. We know some are, you know, there are a lot of evolutionarily based reactions to things that are hardwired. To what extent they are culturally embedded, to what extent they are personal experience that create that sense of sort of readiness to respond in certain ways. That's a question. Nonetheless, we all have it. We may not have it in exactly the same way in exactly the same placements, but we all have it. I teach a course at Catholic U called Beauty and Brains, which is about much of this. And one of the things I ask my students to do is to take an architectural setting that they like and they don't like, and not to do a lot of investigation initially about why, just what's their reaction to it. And then use the language of the course, which is much of the language similar to the language you've been describing in our field these days, to try to break down why they like and why they dislike, and then take the one they dislike and cure it, like a diagnosis and cure process. And that engages them in a way of having to actually identify and problem solve. So it's getting into the design process from the side. So I think that's something we need to worry about, how we do that. And in my own practice for many years, I used something called an affective agenda, in which with my clients, we decided what are the feelings that you'd like to have in the spaces that are for purpose X, Y, or Z, and then use words, which is kind of Tim White's approach to things, adjectives to describe what the qualities of that space might want to be, and then track that prior to making a design, track that through thumbnails and through imagery and through words before designing a partie, before designing a form, before laying out the exit strategy. And then to track that with all the decisions you make through the design process. So that's one example. It embeds the affective goal in the design process.
Yeah, I'm familiar with your program, and I've been following it and enjoying it very much. And before I forget, I sent you an email days ago. Did it ever get to you?
I don't think so.
Someone gave me the wrong email address.
No, I didn't get it.
Right. So I'll. But so they gave me the email Milton at
CUA.edu. No, and it's actually Schinberg. It's Schinberg at CUA.
Yeah. Okay. That's what I've said. So I'll read it.
I have something to send to you.
That email again.
Good.
But no, I've been enjoying your work, and again, I know I just saw a brief film about that I guess came out not too long ago as well.
So I would like to ask if there is another question. I think Margaret maybe would like to ask a question.
Yeah, hi. Thank you for the presentation. I wanted to know what you think, what are some of the ways we might bring back or try and restore our connection to the physicality of space and this sensitivity towards mass and gravity in the design studio? So what are some of the ways we can restore that connection? And also, do you think that in the digital age, are computers coming in between us and this connection, or is there a way that we can work with computers to explore this area?
Well, I think computers are in many ways coming in between, but I mean, this is really sort of a timeless question, and it has sort of, I think, a timeless answer, is that you just go out and look at very good architecture wherever you go, wherever you travel, and just become more acutely aware of every environment that you're in, and whatever its failings, whatever its strengths. I mean, it's just a way of training yourself to fully focus, as it were, within environments. And you can, if you're in Holland, you've got the work of Aldo van Eyck. If you're in Portugal, you have the work of Caesar. You've got these, so you have these good designers have always had these qualities, and you'll see. I mean, if you go into a con building, you'll know it's a con building and not something that was just put together for whatever reason, because again, he worked with a whole palette of materials and spaces, and really just sort of envisioned every aspect of everything that he did as far as the building. So I would just say, just visit and travel as much as you can, and study, very closely the environments that you're in. It's just I'm sure everyone I think learns it that way. Sketching is a good way to do it as well.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Margaret, for this question. We will have to stop for now because our students are already making me be very mindful of the time. But I was also very happy that Margaret made this question, and also in connection with the answer from Harry. Our students have an assignment which exactly encourages them to do this, to go out and experience buildings, and instead of coming up with a project, the project itself is really to focus and be present on the experience of building, and then of course develop this performance and document the performance in a way that the viewer somehow can empathize with their felt experience. So this is a challenge, and I hope that it's another step towards this direction of refocusing and reestablishing of this connection between body and architecture. So we need to finish for now. So once again, I would like to thank again Professor Mallgrave for the wonderful opportunity of having this experience. And I also would like to thank the students for being present here, and also everybody in the audience for being here and participating. So thank you again. We will stop for now, and we will see soon, hopefully.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. I enjoyed it.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.